Hi, and welcome to Bright Minds from Tickmill. I'm your host, Patrick Munnelly, and in this series, we're setting out to answer some of the most commonly asked questions around investment and trading through entertaining and insightful conversations with seasoned insiders. We all like to think that we are rational actors and that our decisions are fact-based, made with cool heads and free from outside influence. However, the fascinating field of behavioural finance tells us a different story. By studying the effects of cognitive biases such as loss aversion, herding, and noise trading, researchers have shown that our subconscious underlying assumptions about how the world works are often wildly inaccurate. Recent research by Dalbar, a leading research company, suggests that the effects of cognitive biases can have a negative impact on portfolio performance of up to 3%. Behavioural finance builds on the groundbreaking work of behavioural economists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose work on loss aversion, heuristics, cognitive biases and priming, among many other phenomena, was summarised in the book Thinking Fast and Slow. By applying the findings of behavioural economics to our own decision-making in the markets, we can start to recognise and understand how our own cognitive biases, which can help us overcome bad decision-making and give us a better chance of trading success. Our guest today is behavioural economics expert Paul Craven. Paul has over 30 years of sales and marketing experience with Schroders, PIMCO, and Goldman Sachs. And he travels the world delivering talks and training to organizations such as Facebook, Lloyds, and BlackRock, among many others. Paul is also a member of the Magic Circle and, as a result, has a unique perspective on the tricks our minds can play. We'll be talking about some of the most common biases that affect investment performance, how to spot them in our own behavior, and ways to overcome them. We'll also be discussing how flawed thinking affects the market at large. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today. Could you get things started by telling us a bit more about your career so far?
Well, I started in the city in 86 and I worked for Schroders for 17 years. And that was an amazing 17 years in many ways, not least because it was a great firm and still is. But of course, in terms of what the markets were doing over that period, we had a 20-year bull market in the 80s and 90s. We had the tech boom. And then we had the crash afterwards. So that was quite a first half to my career in terms of what I witnessed and what I saw. And I think it was then that I began to get interested in behavioural science or behavioural finance, largely because of what the markets and the economists were doing and realising that people weren't quite as rational and as efficient and as evidence-based as the classical economics textbooks said they should be. And that's really where my interest first was sparked. I then was lucky enough to spend a few very happy years at PIMCO. People didn't know much about fixed income in the UK pensions market in those days. They certainly had some, but it wasn't really top of their priority list until the regulations started to change. And that was a great 4 years there where I played a part as a small cog in the wheel to help put PIMCO on the map in the UK. And then I was fortunate enough to move to Goldman Sachs Asset Management in 2007, where I started off as head of UK institutional sales and ended up looking after the European business there until the beginning of 2014. And really over that period, I mean, we've seen so many market cycles, we've seen booms and busts, we've seen so many exciting things and desperately difficult situations, not least the global financial crisis, that I came away from all that, Patrick, thinking, what can I do now? And my first love has always been behavioural finance. And so the last 8 years, I've been waving the flag for that, really trying to explain to people how to use it, both in sort of 2 or 3 ways, really. One is in terms of investment policy. And you've already said, looking at oneself, being self-aware of one's own biases. Secondly, how can we make better decisions within groups? And finally, how can we be better at communicating, better at persuading, better at influencing? So those are really the 3 parts to my behavioural science flag waving.
At an institutional level, do you see behavioural finance being an ethos or a practice that is pushed far more heavily now, or is it still something that's considered more on the periphery of institutions?
Oh, I think it's getting taken much more seriously than it was when I first started looking at it. I think when I first started getting interested in the whole topic, which I would say was probably in the early 2000s when Kahneman got given his Nobel Prize for economics. Sure. That's really when I first started becoming aware of it properly in terms of the financial markets. But in those days, if people started thinking about or talking about it, the typical question I'd receive was, well, how do you monetize it? Is there a product that we can design? And some people said, you want to be a quant investor because that takes out a lot of human decision making. Others said, no, you want to go the kind of Ben Graham, Warren Buffett, sort of more of a value orientated approach. And it was very product driven. Where I think it's got much more sophisticated and intelligent in the last few years is people saying, well, let's not necessarily try and design a product. Let's just try and improve investors' own behavior. So I'm, for example, working with a very exciting group at the moment called Behavioural Lab, who are analysing data, looking at how asset managers, whether they hold on to stocks for too long, whether they sell them too early. So it's not trying to tell them how to manage money or how to value a stock or a bond. It's about when you've decided what you want to buy, how do you hold it? How do you sell it? How do you buy more? And are there patterns in your behavior that come from your biases that if we can analyze and prove they're causing underperformance, what can we do to improve them? And it's a very exciting field, I think. And it's one that I think is the way forward for behavioral finance.
What are some of the most prominent cognitive biases that affect traders or asset managers, and some of the practical ways of overcoming some of the most common biases?
The endowment effect, the idea being that I own something and therefore I like it more, I value it more. I was talking to an American friend of mine once, many years ago, called Charlie Ogle, and he came up with a line that I've never forgotten. He said, smart cowboys don't fall in love with their horses. I think that's so clever if you watch too many Westerns as I do. But of course, in financial terms, what that means is, don't fall in love with your stock. You can buy a stock for the long term, but that's not what I'm arguing against. I'm arguing against someone buying something. It goes up very quickly. And then people find more reasons to stay fully invested or buy some more. Now, again, that might be the right decision for any number of periods. But the danger is, and I've seen this a number of times, is people just end up saying, I can never sell this stock. I love it so much. And of course, you can have a great time on that, on a lovely bull market ride. And then it all finishes. And what was it? Oh, that's slightly politically incorrect phrase that Barton Briggs came out with all those years ago. Bull markets are like sex. They feel best just before the end. So I've learned the tone already. But it wasn't my comment. But that would be one bias that I've certainly identified. And again, looking at the data, looking at someone's data over, say, 3 or 5 years, you start to spot that pretty quickly. Sure. And it can be very helpful to have nudges to remind you of your behavior, because you don't want to end up on the impecunious side of the balance sheet. I think the most pernicious bias, though, is probably confirmation bias. And again, just to refresh people what that means, it means the idea being I've come up with my conclusions. I may have made a good case to buy something, say, a stock, and the fact it's gone down 5 or 10%, it doesn't make me challenge or question myself. Now, I'm sure people listening will think, well, I would, but a lot of people don't. They say, no, I know I'm right. They almost say the market is wrong. And they tend to find more reasons why they're right without thinking, well, where could I be wrong? And that single question, where could I be wrong? 5 words. I think that if I've seen mistakes repeated in my 30 years in the markets, is people don't ask themselves that question. They merely say, give me more reasons why I'm right. And now here's the interesting thing, though. It sounds like you're not confident, and of course our industry, sort of thrives on people who are confident. You can't really go up to your boss and say, look, I've got this really good idea. Let me tell you where I might be wrong. Because it does, it's not very career enhancing. But actually that's what people should be doing sort of unconsciously. Because having that sort of a plan that says, where could I be wrong? And being able to reassess your ideas. And let's face it, I mean, no one gets the markets right all the time. We kid ourselves. If you get markets right just over half, you'll be better than nearly every investor out there, or most investors out there. So it's a confirmation bias is pernicious.
And do you think it's possible for an investor or even just the average person really to fully overcome biases? Or is it more a recognition and acceptance process that you can recognize the behavior coming from the bias?
To take your question, to fully overcome, no, because we're human. And unfortunately, or actually, I would say fortunately, human nature doesn't allow us to become totally machine-like. We're not all GPT-4 in our thinking, and thankfully in many ways. However, we could improve a lot of the ways we do manage money, for example. And I think you touched on it in your question, is just being self-aware that you and I and our fellow listeners all have biases just makes them slightly less dangerous. That's where I would start. Self-awareness, know thyself, in the words of the Delphi Oracle. So how do you get to know yourself? Well, I mentioned one way earlier, looking at your own data, trying to understand your patterns of trading. Do you do certain things at certain times? The sort of science or even the neuroscience in this now is fantastic. You know, people are wired up in trading rooms, are wired up sometimes to look at their hormones, their brain patterns and things to see how they react under stress. And particularly how you react under stress is a really important way of understanding when your biases really begin to manifest themselves. And again, going back to a point earlier about people being overconfident, and overconfidence can become arrogance. Here's a thing that I've noticed in my 30 years, taught to me many years ago, but I've seen it in action. Sometimes your biggest strengths become your biggest weaknesses when you have them in excess. So we like people that are confident and forward thinking and progressive and able to express their views. But actually people who are overly confident become arrogant and therefore almost don't listen to anyone else's views. And it's true of most virtues. Most virtues in excess become a vice, certainly in terms of behavioural science. And so just be aware. And I think there's sort of another piece of advice I give is when you get it right a few times in a row, as many investors do, hopefully that's a function of your skill. And indeed, you'll have evidence to prove it's your skill. However, I would just remind everybody that sometimes you can be lucky. It may not be the process that's good. It may be luck. And ultimately, we all want to be, as investors, skillful and lucky. Now, you can be skillful and unlucky, and there's no doubt about it. I've seen really good investors suffer periods of terrible performance for 1, 2, 3, 4 years sometimes, just because almost they're unlucky. Almost. But the skillful ones reassess, reevaluate, and then come back even stronger. They learn from their mistakes, if you like. It's the ones who are unskillful, who happen to have some luck in the markets, the right sector at the right time through no skill of their own or something. Those are the ones to watch out for because their luck will run out. But just remember when the travellers on the road get wealthier, so do the highwaymen, and we've got to spot the highwaymen from the bona fide travellers.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess that it becomes very true and most prevalent in market bubbles.
Definitely. I mean, I did history at Cambridge about 2,000 years ago, and so I've always had this love of looking back at the old days, whether it would be 10 years ago or 100 years ago or further.
Sure.
And obviously, we now have quite a lot of data on financial markets that goes back certainly to the mid-19th century in many cases, and we have market prices for lots of things that go back a lot further. But in terms of sort of stock markets, and I've always had an interest in studying booms and busts, if you like, or bubbles and crashes. And there's been some good work on it over the years. Charles Kindleberger wrote a good book. But if your listeners want a really interesting book to read that only came out last year, which I've been advocating everyone in the marketplace should read, it's a book called Boom and Bust by William Quinn and John Turner. And what they've done is gone back and looked at about a dozen or so bubbles going back to 1720, but they do things like the mining stocks in the 1820s. They do the Australian land bubble in the late 1880s. They do the US stock market in the 20s, the Japanese bubble in the 80s, and the dot-com bubble. And what they've done is they've come up with something that I think is fascinating. I mean, really, really interesting, whether you're interested in stock markets, whether you're interested in history, whether you're interested in behavioural science. And it's a very, very accessible book. It's very readable. Every chapter it's easy to read. It's not an academic book at all, even though it's written by two academics. They said the concept of bubble is wrong. because a bubble just gives this impression of something sort of just blowing, getting bigger and bigger, and then just popping. And they question that for a number of reasons, not least because they go back and they look at some of their bubbles in history and say, actually, the assumption is that all bubbles are always bad. And actually, there's plenty of bubbles in history, and they talk about it, where lots of good have come out of it.
Sure.
But there are some really, really bad ones, and we've lived through some in the last 3 decades. But what I like most of all about them saying why this bubble concept is not helpful, they say it's more like a fire, not a bubble.
Right.
So forget the word bubble now. I'll try not to use it myself, but I'll fail. To have a fire, you need 3 things. You need fuel, oxygen, and heat. And they look at these 3 different components in terms of a real fire and take this metaphor and say, well, what are the financial market equivalents? So the fuel, for example, which is behind almost every single bubble, is things like loose money, ease of credit, low interest rates, that sort of environment, right? Now, again, look at all the B words, look at all those stock market booms, right? That fuel is there. You need oxygen. Now, what does that mean? You need marketability. So people need to be able to access whatever is the latest exciting idea, whether it be bicycles in the 1890s or tech stocks in the late 1990s. How easy is it for the people to purchase it? How tradable is it? And then finally, the third ingredient in a fire is heat, which is what you and I would call speculation. Can amateurs, novices get hold of it? Because again, a function of most of these stock market booms is that people are buying who probably wouldn't be considered professionals, who help to basically heat up the budget. And so what's the spark that sets it all off? Well, normally it's either some sort of innovation or it's government policy pushing something. And again, it's not my idea. It's Quinn and Turner's idea. But they make a very good case if you accept those three ingredients: fuel, oxygen, heat, light, and a spark that sets them off. And they go through all these bubbles. I have to use the word. I try not to use it. They go through all these booms in markets, and they point out that all 3 of these factors are always there. And why that's so useful for us all now, I think it's the first major work on this subject that actually allows us to identify or help us identify future stock market booms or booms in any asset class. It's not necessarily stock markets, because we look for these 3 ingredients and we say, are they all there? And their argument, again, beautifully argued, beautifully written, easy to understand by the layperson, sets these out. So I've been advocate. So I've gone on a bit too long, but sounds like I've got a commission in this book, but I haven't. But it's a really interesting way of looking at behavioural biases, something I love about, and stock market booms and busts, and trying to sort of quantify and analyse why it's going on. And I think it does highlight the importance of A, looking at the data, and B, remembering that we're all, emotional animals. There was the Jonathan Haidt phrase, the emotional tail wags the rational dog.
And I guess that leads into another area, which is obviously in the headlines of late, is obviously the rise of artificial intelligence and robo-advisors. And what do you think there's a role for them to play in the field of behavioral finance? I.e., does using machine learning help eliminate bias, or is that achievable on the premise that most of this stuff is designed by human beings in the first place anyway?
I'm not an expert in AI. I've been playing around with GPT-4 quite a lot in the last few weeks, normally asking it to do sillier things like rewrite Shakespeare in the style of Bob Dylan or something. But in all seriousness, will machines and machine learning help us overcome human biases in investment? Listen, I'm sure there will be people out there saying, of course it will in time, and I have no reason to doubt them in terms of the way the technology is improving. But I do believe, and this may be wishful thinking, this may be my own biases in play here, when I talk to people who play chess at a very, very serious senior level, they tell me the following things: the machine will beat a human being. The best machine will beat the best human beings. However, the combination of a human being and a machine will beat the best machine. So
Right.
if that's true, and if that carries over that simple argument, and it may be too simple, but I retain my faith in the ability of human beings to make good decisions for the benefit of, in this case, investment or chess or whatever it may be.
Excellent. And I just want to roll back to one aspect of the introduction that I don't think I have given due care and attention to, and that's what's the connection in your mind between behavioural finance and the magic circle?
Yeah. For me, they meet around the back of the circle in my head. Let me just tell you why. Because for me, behavioural finance or behavioural science or behavioural economics is all about understanding how we do and don't think particularly well, and what we get right, what we get wrong. When is our intuition absolutely wonderful, and when do we have perfectly good mental shortcuts that we then apply in the wrong environment so they look irrational? That to me is how real people make real decisions in the real world. That's my favourite homegrown definition of behavioural science. Why do I love magic? Because magic actually exploits the fact that the mind doesn't work well. And first of all, I should say one thing very quickly, because I have friends who say, well, the trouble is that magic's deceptive. And I say, no, it's an honest contract between performer and spectator. The magician has a sort of unwritten contract. I will fool you. I will try and show you something that will amaze you, give you sort of sense of wonder. Yeah. And that's our agreement, right? And if he or she does a good job, they will get the applause, or the, dare I say, the wide-mouthed open amazement, and which is obviously the idea. So what's the link between the two? They're both about how the human mind doesn't work, and for me, that's why my passion, my hobby, my pastime, magic. And I'm not a professional magician as such, although I do use it a lot when I try and explain in my talks, for example, at conferences, how the mind doesn't work from an investment point of view. I will use psychological experiments in my talks for the whole audience to see the strange ways their mind can work, even though they think they're logical, rational, evidence-based, analytical, data-driven, etc., etc. In real life, they can be those things, but they're not always those things. What Kahneman calls distinguishing between System 1 and System 2 thinking.
Excellent. Paul, thank you so much for your time today. Is there anywhere our listeners can go to follow you online?
Well, I tweet a lot as @Craven Partners. I've got a website, paulcraven.com, and I'm about 4/5 the way through finishing the book that I started during COVID, which is really my non-academic take on behavioural science. Covers a lot of stuff I've seen in my career, my life, and other people's stories as well, and tries to really explain a little bit more about behavioural science and how we can basically become better decision makers, whatever we do. So hopefully that book will be out later this year.
Brilliant, Paul. Well, thanks again for your time today, and really appreciate the input around behavioural finance, and certainly that link to the magic circle. Thanks again, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.